Well, let me open up our event today by saying what a distinct honor and privilege it is to welcome you all to what is the first public event hosted by the Center for China Analysis in Washington, D.C. We've done a number of activities in New York and elsewhere around the world in the Asia Society Global Network, but we're very, very happy to be able to stage what I hope is the first of many activities, events, programming here in Washington. Thanks very much. I'm Bates Gill. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for China Analysis at the Asia Society Policy Institute. And I just wanted to say a few words about the Center for China Analysis. I know many of you have been involved with us in other activities, but for those of you who aren't aware, the Center for China Analysis, or CCA, was established in October last year, so we're still a relatively young organization, a part of the Asia Society Policy Institute. But we've grown rapidly over those past 8 months. We now have about 30 full and part-time staff, researchers and staff, which makes us one of the larger and maybe one of the largest China shops in the United States, among think tanks, maybe even in the world. We've been active in producing a lot of content, both online and through sort of traditional think tank policy reporting work, some 18 or 20 of those out now over the past 8 months, ranging across the 5 major topics of our work, which are Chinese domestic politics, China's economy and technology, Chinese foreign policy and national security, China's climate and environment and energy policies, and work on China's domestic society, culture, and public health. I recommend to you to have a look at some of the public-facing, innovative, even trailblazing web-based content that we've been generating over the past 8 months. Many of you would be familiar with the Decoding Chinese Politics website, which does a spectacular job of tracking Chinese elite politics and their connections amongst one another across a range of functional and policy-related activities. That has become, in just the short time that it's been up and running, easily the most visited part of the Asia Society website, and we're very pleased to be able to provide that as a kind of global public good for officials, for journalists, for scholars, for people who want to get a better read on developments in China's domestic politics and elite politics in particular. So I welcome you to take a look at the work that we're doing and to take part with us in some of this work, as many of you have already been able to do. I'm especially pleased in that we can bring together, as we do today, some of the best minds on China to be able to discuss its impact on regional and global affairs. The way we phrase it at the Center for China Analysis is we try to understand China from the inside out. We bring to bear, all of us as researchers and staff in the CCA, our Chinese linguistic abilities. All of us have had significant experience and exposure inside China. We have good networks and relationships there still. And to try to draw from those connections and knowledge bases a better understanding of where China's going and translate that into sounder responses and policies as we all grapple with the challenges and opportunities of China's growing role in the world. So today we're going to be taking an interesting angle on trying to understand China and its impact in its region and in world affairs by looking at what is obviously, we all recognize, one of the most consequential issues in U.S.-China relations, and that has to do with our relationship with Taiwan. And as the United States and China enter into this era of greater strategic competition, how these two countries, the United States and China, manage this relationship with Taiwan is going to likely determine prospects for war and peace in the Indo-Pacific for the years to come. And of course, everyone in this town recognizes that the U.S. Congress, in particular, has played an indispensable and quite unique role in shaping American policy toward Taiwan over these many, many decades. And the passage of the Taiwan Relations Act in 1979, solidified that role. In recent years, I think we'll be hearing about the passage of several new laws, such as the Taiwan Policy Act, the Taiwan Enhanced Resilience Act. These have underscored even further the leading role of Congress in bolstering U.S.-Taiwan relations and trying to ensure that Taiwan has the means to protect itself against coercion and forcing it to take decisions against its collective will. So today, and for the remaining months of this year, as we approach the 45th anniversary of the Taiwan Relations Act in January of next year, the Center for China Analysis is going to be assembling a number of roundtables with top experts, as we see in front of us here today, to take stock of the Taiwan Relations Act and assess the continuing relevance and impact of Congress's role in promoting U.S. interests in Taiwan. So I'm so pleased we have this great panel of great experts to be able to take us through these issues. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my CCA colleague, Lyle Morris, who is a senior fellow on foreign policy and national security at CCA, based here in Washington, and he'll moderate this morning's discussion. Lyle, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Bates, and thank you, everyone, for joining. So let me just get to the point of why we're having this panel. The reason we wanted to hold this panel is to reflect on the role of Congress in U.S.-Taiwan affairs. As Bates mentioned, we're approaching the 45th anniversary of the Taiwan Relations Act, but also to discuss what Congress is doing now and in the future as we look ahead to future years on U.S.-Taiwan relations and relations between the U.S. and the PRC. As I think everyone in this room knows, a lot has changed in cross-strait relations since 1979, since the TRA was passed, to include the balance of power shifting quite drastically towards the PRC. But you're also seeing, I think, some of the most consequential bills on Taiwan in Congress, I think, in decades. And these would fundamentally reshape how the U.S. meets Taiwan's defense needs and U.S. defense strategy towards Taiwan. So to help us understand these dynamics, I'm really excited to have with us today Anne Kowalewski, who is the professional staff member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Ms. Bonnie Glaser, the director of the Asia program of the German Marshall Fund of the United States, Mr. Russell Hsiao, the executive director of the Global Taiwan Institute, and Mr. Jacques deLisle, who is the Stephen A. Cozen Professor of Law and Political Science and director of the Center for Study of Contemporary China at the University of Pennsylvania. You all hopefully have their bios, so I won't read their bios at length. So what I've asked the panelists to do is to kick things off by having some framing remarks, offering some framing remarks no longer than 10 minutes. And what I've asked them to do is look at kind of each of their own perspectives on the role of Congress in Taiwan affairs, starting with the Taiwan Relations Act and also looking at contemporary bills. After that, I'm going to ask the panelists a few follow-up questions, and then we'll close with some audience Q&A at the end. So with that, I think I'd like to turn it over to Annie first to start, and we'll go left to right down the panel. And again, thank you all for coming. And Annie, please, it's over to you.
Thank you. First off, I must say that I am here in a personal capacity. The discussion today will not reflect the views of the U.S. government, the U.S. Congress, the House Foreign Affairs Committee, or the chairman. So thanks, Lyle and Bates, for the invitation to come speak today. I have been asked to essentially justify my job as to why Congress is doing stuff on Taiwan. So I'd like to make 5 initial points, and then I'll turn it over to the rest of our panelists. The first point is, again, to justify my job and just point out that Congress has always historically played a very forward-leaning role in Taiwan policy. As we're discussing today, the Taiwan Relations Act is still very much the foundation of the U.S. policy towards Taiwan, and that didn't come from the executive branch, that came from Congress. And in the 1990s, there was also a resolution in Congress that was passed, that was signed into law by President Clinton, who elevated the Taiwan Relations Act to become the foundational law governing U.S.-Taiwan relations, and that put that Taiwan Relations Act over even the joint communiques that we made with China. The second point I'd like to make is that Congress today really sees Taiwan as facing a very serious threat of coercion and force. I think if we look at it from our perspective of China watchers, there's kind of two data points that really have shifted Congress's view on this. And first is the idea that Xi Jinping has now had a third term and is seeking essentially presidency or chairmanship for life. So every single Chinese government president and chairman has said that they were seeking unification with Taiwan. But every single president has also had a mandatory retirement where they have said, well, this is an easy political way out to say, I didn't achieve unification in my term, but I moved the needle closer for my successor, sorry. And I think we now see that Xi has not only staked his legitimacy on this issue, but also because he doesn't have that easy political way out, he really needs to focus on ways to achieve unification. And the second thing Congress sees is that the non-violent options are kind of falling off the table, right? The economic closeness between China and Taiwan, we see Taiwanese businesses starting to diversify away from China because of the untenable business environment in China. We see politically, we have the DPP in power who, regardless of how we believe the Chinese influence in Taiwanese elections, what extent that might be, we know that the DPP is not the CCP's preferred candidate. And then we also see, as we've exchanged increased people-to-people ties across the strait with China and Taiwan, that the Taiwanese identity has really taken root. So as we're looking at all the pathways to unification, we see a lot of the non-violent, the non-forceful ways falling off the table, and that makes members increasingly concerned about what the future of China-Taiwan relations might look like. So that's the second point. The third point, I think, is as we're looking at the Taiwan Relations Act and we're looking at our own capabilities and our relationship with Taiwan, we see that the United States is really not fulfilling some of the commitments that they made in the Taiwan Relations Act. And there's two particular prongs that are always discussed. The first is the U.S. has made a commitment to provide Taiwan with arms of a defensive character, and we see massive arms sales delays, and we see a lack of mill-to-mill communications and discussions, and also a lack of exercises and training. And the second is the second commitment in the Taiwan Relations Act is the U.S. has pledged to maintain the U.S. capacity to resist coercion and force against the people, the social, the political, and the economic life of the people of Taiwan. So that is also a worrying trend for us because we see our capacity and we don't see our capacity as strong enough to resist forms of coercion and force from the PRC against Taiwan. So that's also where you might see a little bit more attention being put to the United States posture in the Indo-Pacific, and our bilateral relationship with Taiwan is perhaps not as robust as it should be to be able to resist these forms of coercion and force. The fourth, the legislation that has been passed in Congress, the intent was really not to change our Taiwan policy, but to ensure that we are living up to these commitments in the Taiwan Relations Act. So, for example, the commitment to make sure Taiwan has arms of a defensive character, that's really where you see a lot of the Arms Export Control Act issues or the changes to the FMS process is really to try to get Taiwan the capacity it needs more quickly and in a realistic timeline based on the geopolitical tensions that we see. We also see building Taiwan's defense capacity as a commitment in the Taiwan Relations Act, and this is where kind of the Taiwan Policy Act, which was changed into the Taiwan Enhanced Resilience Act, and last year's NDAA mentions a little bit more than just arms sales. So it talks about training for Taiwanese armed forces, talks about stockpiles on the island, talks about foreign military sales and foreign military financing specifically, so that the U.S. kind of has skin in the game as well. But we also see to that second commitment that we don't see ourselves living up to is maintaining the U.S. capacity. So this is where we see the non-military legislation in Congress really addressing. So there's legislation being considered in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee right now about anti-double taxation with Taiwan. We want more people-to-people ties with Taiwan. We have the Taiwan Fellowship Act that passed last year. And then we see an increase of CODELs going to Taiwan and staff DELs going to Taiwan to increase that kind of government-level exchange. We also see that, the other part of that is making sure that we're not holding back unnecessarily on our relationship with Taiwan. So in the Taiwan Assurance Implementation Act, we are making sure that our contact guidelines with Taiwan are as robust as they can be, because we do feel that there's a lot more maneuverability we have under the Taiwan Relations Act that we're just not fully implementing. So essentially, these 4 points lead essentially to the last point, which is that there's been a lot of legislation being passed on Taiwan recently and being introduced on Taiwan recently. And the point of that is not to change the Taiwan Relations Act or change our policy towards Taiwan. It's really to ensure that we are fulfilling our commitments to the fullest extent and in a way that is realistic with the current geopolitical tensions that we see in the Taiwan Strait. And all this legislation essentially has 3 lines of messaging. The first line is, of course, to deter the PRC from using force or coercion against Taiwan. The second one is to assure Taiwan, to say the United States is a partner and we are going to pursue close and extensive ties, like we said in the Taiwan Relations Act. And the third is also just a message to the U.S. government, not only other U.S. Congress members, but also the U.S. executive branch, to say we need to wake up and we need to make sure that we're holding up our end of the bargain as well, and that we are following U.S. law to the fullest extent.
Fantastic. Thank you, Annie. Bonnie, over to you.
Great. Well, thank you, Bates and Lyle. Appreciate the opportunity. It's always important, I think, to review the Taiwan Relations Act, the role that it's played, and whether it is still the best way to ensure that our relationship with Taiwan remains strong. And over the years, I've been part of so many of these sort of the annual discussions on the TRA. I want to start, though, just with some remarks about the TRA itself. It really has been, I think, a durable and effective foundation for our policy. It's, I'm fairly sure, the only law that governs nearly every aspect of U.S. relations with a foreign government in the absence of having diplomatic relations. And it really set out not only clear policy objectives, but also an institutional framework to achieve those objectives. And it's really remarkable, looking back so many decades later, how it has stood the test of time. And I'm glad to hear, Annie, that there is no movement in Congress to try to change the Taiwan Relations Act. So the real question is, what else needs to be done in other kinds of legislation to fulfill the goals of the TRA? Because I wonder whether going forward there will be a push to really revise the TRA, and that's something we could talk about, the advisability of doing that. We know, of course, that China's opposed the TRA for a very long time, but of course, it is first and foremost it's U.S. law, and it really has fostered stability in our policy toward Taiwan, as well as contributed to regional security. And I think it's helped to enable Taiwan to become the vibrant democracy that it is today. Essentially, the TRA enabled Taiwan to be treated in U.S. law as if it were a state, the government to be treated as if it's the government of a recognized state. And that's been extremely important. As we face challenges when we want to do things with Taiwan, we do need to have the legislation that tells us how to deal with Taiwan. And the one issue today, of course, is this anti-double taxation treaty issue, where for so many years, I think many people just threw up their hands and said, but we don't have diplomatic ties with Taiwan, so we can't sign a treaty with Taiwan. So this is in the too hard box. And now people are looking for ways to solve that. So that's one example of sort of a question mark. Do you need to revise the TRA to fix it permanently, or do you just have workarounds? And there are effective workarounds. But is that the best way to deal with it? Obviously, the 3 U.S.-China communiques and even the 6 assurances are not U.S. law. So that is quite different than the TRA. The TRA really binds the president and his subordinates. I think it's accurate when U.S. officials, and this has really only happened since the Trump administration, have putting the TRA first when they describe our one China policy, and they say it is composed of the Taiwan Relations Act and the 3 U.S.-China communiques and the 6 assurances. I noted that when our Secretary of State was recently in China and then afterwards talked about it, once he put the TRA first, and another time he put the U.S.-China joint communiques first. There's a little bit of inconsistency in some of the ways that the United States refers to that. And there are people who think the communiques should be cited first. I'm not one of them. So Annie mentioned the provision of the TRA that requires the U.S. to provide weapons to Taiwan. I think that is one of the most important provisions. I believe there's no language in the TRA that could provide us, even if you did revise the language, that would provide us with any quick solution to supply chain problems that have caused something like $19 billion in backlog of weapons sales. So I don't think that's a TRA problem, but if you have suggestions of legal fixes, I'd be happy to listen to them. But certainly in the absence of that mandate, Taiwan would have far less military capability. It would be more vulnerable to Chinese military pressure, even more vulnerable than it is today. It's worth noting the language that you mentioned about coercion, which I think was really prescient. I mean, who in 1979 would have really thought about the kind of coercion that we see, diplomatic, military, economic, that is taking place against Taiwan. And the language is that the U.S. shall maintain the capacity of the United States to resist to any resort to force or other forms of coercion that would jeopardize the security or social or economic system of the people of Taiwan. I think that's become a massive problem. And I would say that there is far more attention today paid to the need to prevent a Chinese use of force against Taiwan than there is to this problem of growing coercion, something that I and Ryan Hass and Richard Book wrote about in our recent book on U.S. Taiwan relations. And there are people in the United States who think we should only be focused on preventing the invasion, and we should ignore all of these other forms of coercion that's going on. And my view is we do have to have a balance when we deal with those issues. But it's remarkable that the drafters really anticipated that PRC coercion would become so central to Beijing's policy toward Taiwan many decades later. I think it's only been in the last 5 years approximately that Congress has enacted laws that seek to strengthen Taiwan's security and U.S. ties with Taiwan. And that's really interesting that there wasn't a need to do that previously. It does suggest that there are many in Congress that believe that the TRA is insufficient and in some ways needs to be supplemented. So just a couple of closing points. One is, as Annie at the end of her presentation talked about these sort of 3 goals of U.S. of the Congress in supplementing the legislation for Taiwan. So if one goal is to deter the PRC, I do think we have to look into the various kinds of legislation that is, much of it, of course, is not passed. Many bills were introduced last year. I think we have about 30 this year. Few of them have passed, but not all of the provisions, in my view, are aimed at deterring the PRC or take into account whether in trying to strengthen Taiwan, the effect would be to deter China or to provoke China. And I think we'll have a discussion later in more detail, so I won't go into it right now, but I want to put on the table the idea that we have to be careful about doing things that are primarily symbolic, whereas we do need to reassure Taiwan. We have to ensure we reassure Taiwan in ways that will not provoke the the attack or even extensive military pressure on Taiwan that we seek to avoid, because the goal is to strengthen Taiwan's security, not to undermine it. And I think excessive focus on symbolism could also undermine the growing consensus in the United States around supporting Taiwan. And so I think we have to be aware of that. We can talk about that more later. And so I sense that there is not a discussion in Congress, or a sufficient discussion in Congress, about understanding what provokes and what deters China. I'm not even sure there's a focus on that in our policy and our intelligence community. So I think that it's a very important question. And then finally, I'll just say that there continues to be tension, and I'd be interested in the other panelists' comment on this tension between Congress's view of its role regarding Taiwan and oversight, and, of course, the view of the executive branch that they have primary right to set foreign policy. And I just as an example, I think this was the Taiwan Policy Act, but it may not have been. Just as an example of a spokesman's statement after a bill was signed by the president, saying, we have concerns with elements of this bill which would contradict and undermine the U.S. government's longstanding One China policy and contravene the president's constitutional authorities to determine the United States position on the status of Taiwan and to determine the manner of diplomatic communications with the representatives of Taiwan. And it's probably a fairly standard statement, but it is interesting. You continue to have this tension between what the role of Congress is and what the role of the executive is. Ideally, we want to have a closer relationship between Congress and the executive, working towards the same objectives, because we all want to see a stronger Taiwan and a stronger U.S.-Taiwan relationship. But that tension, I think, continues to be a challenge for the United States. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Bonnie. Russell, please.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Lyle, and thank you, Bates, for having me here and joining this very distinguished panel of experts and practitioners working on Taiwan policy. As a new think tank in Washington, D.C., focused exclusively on Taiwan policy, our primary focus day in, day out is to analyze and to inform the discussions surrounding Taiwan, the economic, security, and political dimensions. And so, paying a close attention to the various levers of policy here in Washington, D.C. is critically important. And, Congress, as my co-panelists have referenced, played both a very unique and indispensable role when it comes to Taiwan policy. I think unique in the sense that, as has been already stated, that there are no other issues where, you'll find Congress so vigorously and assertively position itself in the policy debate, and certainly also as well in the bipartisan nature of the support and for policy issues related to Taiwan. Critical in the sense that, as been referenced already, the historical role that that the Congress as well as the Taiwan Relations Act plays. It's worth remembering that in light, with regards to the criticality of Congress, that had it not been the Congress's role in asserting itself during the process of normalization of ties with the People's Republic of China, the Taiwan Relations Act would not be what it exists today. It would not be the enduring framework that it exists today, because the executive branch had already initially submitted a Taiwan Enabling Act that was supposed to be the governing relations with Taiwan, but given the reaction by Congress about of it being inadequately addressing some of the security provisions in assistance to Taiwan, Congress responded with the Taiwan Relations Act. And I would recommend anyone who is really interested in the sort of legislative intent of the Taiwan Relations Act to refer to this book that's put together by former Congressman Lester Wolf, who fortunately passed away in 2021. His book about the legislative intent of the Taiwan Relations Act, a dilemma wrapped in an enigma. And in it, he provides a detailed account of all the legislative debate that went into the formulation of what became the Taiwan Relations Act and the various provisions, because if we really want to understand what Congress meant and intended with the TRA, we have to go look at the legislative intent of those who have drafted and passed and ultimately enacted that legislations. And that is essentially what became the enduring framework, and that has allowed for the peace and stability that the TRA has been able to generate. And in it, I think what we'll find, as both the drafters of the legislations have indicated, that this legislation was intended from the very beginning to be intentionally ambiguous. It was the only way that it could really pass the political process at the time with the negotiations with the executive branch, which wanted to honor its commitments to the People's Republic of China under the various communiques that it had signed, but also be able to negotiate and address the enduring interest and concern that the American people had and with ties with the Taiwan and Republic of China. And as such, it was through this process that was able to negotiation of political discussions and negotiations that this framework was developed that became very adaptive, that was also very responsive to addressing the various issues that we now confront. I think if we look into the language of the Taiwan Relations Act, we'll find that there is wide latitude in which it provides for conducting relations with Taiwan. And essentially going forward, I think the role of Congress essentially serves three critical functions. And this is what we've seen in the various bills and legislations that were referenced. But essentially those are authorization, appropriations, and oversight role. And authorization bills, of course, can establish, continue, and modify agencies and their programs. We oftentimes focus a lot just on the authorizations bills, but appropriations is also critically important because that provides for the resources and the spendings that the agencies can conduct for programs that have been previously authorized. Oversight, of course, ensures what I think Annie referred to on numerous occasions about the faithful implementation of the law. And I think all those three functions are really where Congress stands in a very critical way in ensuring that the executive branch continues to implement policy in accordance to American interests and values. And so how they do that and how they impact policy essentially also comes down to three different types of forms. One is by through a sense of Congress. Second is also a declaration of U.S. policy, and third is providing legislative directed obligations on the executive branch to perform certain actions. Obviously, in terms of the sense of Congress, these are non-binding, and they essentially advise the president to do something or not to do something. But also, legislative act by Congress can impose obligations on the executive branch to report to Congress. And this is, of course, pursuant to its oversight functions that such reporting functions can provide for a broader public understanding and of these issues, in accordance, of course, to congressional guidance. It's important to point out, of course, a lot of these advisories do not establish a mandatory obligation on the executive branch. It does provide for wide discretion for the executive branch to implement policy, and that's always a source of kind of tension between the executive branch and Congress with regards to authorities, as Bonnie alluded to earlier. But it's worth remembering that Congress has the inherent power of the purse, and it could also withhold appropriations when it considers appropriate and warranted, should Congress determine that the executive branch is not faithfully executing the law. In terms of congressional declaration of policy, a bill or act can set out objectives for U.S. policy, but oftentimes these declarations are conditional, and you'll find in the language of these legislations that they are determined as an as appropriate basis. So, which again, a deference to the executive branch and to some extent in terms of implementation of the law. So essentially, in terms of the Taiwan Relations Act, Congress fulfills, I think, three critical purposes, right? First is ensuring the faithful implementation of the legislative intent of the Taiwan Relations Act. Second, I would say that it is important in expressing the will of the American people. And thirdly, of course, it's performing the oversight function of the executive branch. As a reference alluded to earlier, one of the architects of the Taiwan Relations Act is this former Congressman Lester Wolf, and his amendments with that of Senator Ted Kennedy were eventually what became the Taiwan Relations Act. And a shameless, self-organizational plug here for GTI, we were able to feature Congressman Wolf in a webinar in January of 2021 to discuss his book. And this was really one of his last appearances, I think, that he had before he passed away in May of 2021. But he really underscored how the legislative intent of the TRA was to ensure Taiwan's viability, regardless of the U.S. One China policy, and that the TRA protects Taiwan and supports its freedom from China's claim of sovereignty over while Taiwan and China settle their differences. He spoke of also the need of clarifying the TRA, and I think what we're seeing from the supplemental legislations that were referenced by both Anne and Bonnie are not intended. I agree, not intended to change. Certainly Annie, being in the position that she is, would know, but certainly more intended to clarify some of the ambiguities in the TRA to make clear as to what U.S. interests and values are, and that way it can be carefully communicated to both the PRC and also Taiwan. I believe that these congressional initiatives can help shape policy also when the executive branch may seem to be, maybe irresponsive to some of the legislative intent of the law. But also it could be help to reinforce and support the executive branch to show, the support of both the legislative and executive branch. This will help to also bolster a more effective U.S. foreign policy when both branches of government are in accordance with one another. So a little bit about the supplemental legislations. Essentially, in my view, I think a lot of these legislations are intended to help clarify as well as broaden the scope of Taiwan policy by also ensuring that there is more oversight functions for Congress to ensure that U.S. interests as well as values as defined by the Taiwan Relations Act are faithfully implemented by successive administration. Obviously, China is very unhappy with a lot of these congressional initiatives on Taiwan policy, but I would argue that a lot of the efforts made by Congress in recent years are intended to as a course correction that has resulted from excessive deference to the PRC's sensitivities when it comes to issues related to Taiwan, and as a result, in practice, U.S. policy towards Taiwan had been wrapped in a lot of self-imposed constraints over decades, and I think such initiatives now that we are seeing put on the table, pursuant to the Taiwan Relations Act, are intended to be able to broaden that foundation, solidify that foundation, and be able to put forward a more durable framework for U.S. policy towards Taiwan. I think essentially when we think about these congressional initiatives, they are building out a broader foundation for U.S. policy, and in certain ways also imposing some normative constraints on executive actions towards Taiwan. And that way it helps to provide more durability in how U.S. approaches to Taiwan policy. I think with that I'll just close. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Russell. Jacques.
Well, thanks. So being the last person on the panel, everything's already been said, but being an academic, I think anything we're saying is worth saying at least twice. So let me try and hit some of the same themes in a slightly different format, which is, I would agree with what's been said before. Notwithstanding all the legislation we've seen in the last 5 years and the many bills introduced that haven't passed in this Congress and in many prior Congresses, the TRA still stands alone, 45 years on, as a uniquely stable and durable and adaptable pillar of U.S.-Taiwan relations. That's reflected in its being often explicitly and even more often implicitly referenced in the new legislation. It gets cited a lot. That's kind of along with the three communiques and the 6 assurances. The virtues of the TRA here is what it has done and what I think it still largely continues to do, albeit now with more supplementation. So as my colleagues have said, fundamentally, it offers an assurance to Taiwan that the U.S. would continue not unconditional or unlimited, but genuine support for Taiwan despite the termination of the Mutual Defense Treaty, recognition, formal diplomatic relations, and so on. And it would try to deter China from attacking or coercing, that point as well, to Taiwan into changing the status quo. We see this despite the U.S. acknowledgement in the communiques of the PRC's position, and what was then the ROC's position, that there is one China that includes Taiwan and that the PRC is the sole legitimate government. So the TRA does this in uniquely legal legislative ways. It provides, through a couple of mechanisms, a second-best legislative substitute for what Taiwan lost in 1979. It treats the ROC, as Bonnie says, as something akin to the status of a recognized government, and Taiwan as something akin to a state for purposes of U.S. law, and provides an informal substitute for diplomatic relations, AIT, TECRO, things like that. And it provides something of a weaker substitute for the old Mutual Security Pact and the provisions on selling defensive arms, and declaring that the U.S. Is opposed to any coercive change in the status quo, and that it will maintain the capacity to push back against acts that jeopardize security of Taiwan, and so on. The TRA has been especially important in doing this because it has done a few things. First, it has provided, as my colleagues have said, one of the key pillars of U.S.-Taiwan policy and U.S. policy toward China with respect to Taiwan. It's up there with the 3 communiques and now the 6 assurances, often put first in the list, but even when not put first in the list, it has a particular gravitas as an act of Congress. And what the TRA, along with the other sacred texts, do is that they limit the risks and costs of statements by U.S. officials that stray a bit off the safe ground of the core policy principles, and thus it makes it a lot easier to scurry back to safety and to declare, sometimes a little disingenuously, that there has been no change in U.S. policy. It's a very useful device in pushing back against China in that regard. There are many examples of the straying over the years. We could argue about whether Biden's 4 statements about defending Taiwan and 2 statements about Taiwan determining its own future, whether those are straying or not. But again, we've seen many examples over many administrations that lean in both directions away from the core policies. Secondly, the TRA is a strong policy statement by a branch of government that is at least co-equal with the president and the executive branch. And in that sense, it adds something the executive cannot do on its own to commit the U.S. to certain policies toward Taiwan. Thirdly, the TRA has the twofold genius of acoustical separation. That is, partly it's a product of the TRA's modesty. It's just domestic law. So it is this as-if thing, and that provides a useful duck from the Chinese claim the U.S. is violating the 3 communiques. China says they're treaties, we say they're not, but even if you accept that they are treaties, we're just talking about domestic law. And by the way, nice little feature of U.S. constitutional structures that a subsequent piece of legislation trumps a treaty, so we've made that commitment. Partly it's a matter of the TRA's robustness, not its modesty. As an act of Congress, as my colleagues have said, it binds the president in a way that mere foreign policy statements, even very solemn ones, like the communiques, cannot. Treaties even can, of course, be unilaterally terminated by the president. How do we know this? Well, Goldwater v. Carter, which was about terminating the Mutual Defense Treaty with Taiwan. Fourth, this last feature allows, and with an assertive Congress might pressure, presidents and other executive branch officials dealing with China to play a 2-level game. What can I do? The TRA binds me, and subsequent legislation binds me too. And if the president doesn't want to be bound, Congress will make it known that it thinks the executive is straying from its directives and mandates. But in terms of the role of Congress and the TRA in U.S.-Taiwan affairs, it's also important to be mindful of what the TRA does not do. And we've heard this on this panel already too. That is, the TRA and the more recent legislation, for the most part, does not commit or is not treated as committing the U.S. to actually defending Taiwan no matter what, or requiring the U.S. to make any particular types or level of arms sales, or to engage in any particular type or level of informal diplomatic relations or support for Taiwan's international space or participation. So that's why it has endured. It's allowed flexibility and adaptation on all of those fronts over 4.5 decades. And if it were to do much more than that, we would then get into an interbranch conflict, which I think ultimately would not be helpful for Taiwan as we tussle over what's Congress's power and what's the president's. Bonnie quoted a boilerplate presidential signing statement. I used to write those when I worked at OLC, but they are important and they put down markers and there will be pushback against it. So I think, it stayed nicely within those bounds because you would get pushback about foreign affairs power, commander-in-chief powers, and so on. Turning to the more recent legislation that's come down, for many years the TRA really did stand alone, fundamentally unamended. Lots of bills introduced, nothing passed, and then suddenly 5-6 years ago, things started changing. And you all know the litany, right? It's an alphabet soup: NDAAs, TTA, ARIA, Taipei Act, TERA, the Taiwan Assurance Implementation Act, and all that sort of stuff. Taiwan Assurance Act, and many, many unpassed bills as well. At a general level, there's a lot to be said for at least some of what's in these bills in terms of advancing the original purposes of the TRA, which you can see here in this big, thick book that Russell brought. It does a bunch of things here that I think are worth underscoring. First, it does, especially given the overwhelming majority of support for these bills, it does signal in a bipartisan and still cross-branch way support for Taiwan that is especially useful in an era when there has been mounting doubt in Beijing and in Taipei about the credibility of U.S. commitments to Taiwan and thus deterrence of China, especially in terms of defending Taiwan against not only attack but other forms of coercion. And in an era when there are doubts about the stability of U.S. policy on anything, given the polarized politics and so on. And here we see a lot of legislation, I think we can talk about in detail, does do that. In addition, it's also useful as a strong congressional statement if you think you need to mast bind the president. And we've heard some of that on this panel already too. Secondly, the provisions urging closer defense cooperation and more robust regular and less successfully subsidized arms sales are a sensible response to a shifting military balance across the straits and the need to do more asymmetrical defense. Thirdly, provisions urging higher level diplomatic engagement or relaxation of the former restrictions, participation for Taiwan, support for Taiwan's participation in non-state member-only international organizations, keeping Taiwan's formal ties with its handful of diplomatic partners. All of those are in the bills. You have support for that. And this makes sense in an era when China has ratcheted up the pressure on Taiwan's international space and stature. Fourthly, the new bills, I think, do a better job than the old laws of recognizing the importance of the economic dimension of the relationship. Support for the trade agreement, support for the taxation treaty. That's a key pillar that was, I think, understated in the original law. And the references to U.S. sanctions on China and Chinese individuals in the event of attacks, although some of those, as I'll say in a moment, may go a bit far. Fifth and finally on this point, the multiple provisions that stress Taiwan's democratic accomplishments. There is that stray reference to human rights in the TRA, which was actually a stick with which to hit Taiwan at the time. It has, of course, profoundly transformed, and now these bills recognize Taiwan's democratic bona fides as an important pillar of U.S. support for Taiwan. So these are generally complementary to executive branch moves, especially in an era when the executive branch, President, certainly under Biden, has gone more pro-Taiwan. Some of the concerns about congressional legislation have ameliorated. It used to be Congress pro-Taiwan, executive less so. I think that gap has kind of closed, at least for the moment. And the concern that congressional legislation would mess up a pretty good U.S.-China relations, well, that's no longer really the world we live in. But that's not to say there aren't concerns, and I'll close with these. First, the mere existence of lots of new legislation risks diluting the potency of the TRA as the single congressional lodestar, and I think that's to be worried about. Secondly, although congressional damage to a good U.S.-Taiwan relationship is a passé concern, damaging a really bad relationship is a legitimate concern too. So I would second Bonnie's caution about thinking hard about cost-benefit analysis. That's not to say don't do it, but it's to say think about what the net effect on Taiwan's security is going to be. Things in the bills that have edged closer to mandating rather than encouraging or supporting executive branch action, I think raise this interbranch problem, and you could see mixed signals and perhaps executive pushback against things that would otherwise be supportable. And I would second Bonnie's point about symbolic rather than substantive issues. Renaming TECRO as the Taiwan Representative Office, declaring Taiwan a major non-NATO ally, these kinds of things are potentially more harmful than helpful. And relatedly, you don't want to needlessly feed Beijing's self-serving narrative that the US is playing the Taiwan card to keep China down and to impede China's place in the world. And there are provisions one could point to that says that. Finally, you could point to the Pelosi visit as a nice example of Congress loving Taiwan a bit too much in a way that doesn't necessarily help Taiwan's cause. Now, while the argument that US policy needs to offer reassurance to Beijing as conjoined with the threat side of deterrence is easily overstated, risk creating a moral hazard of deferring to Beijing's concocted red lines and so on. Nonetheless, you do have to worry about these kinds of balancing issues. And it's notable that the TRA and all of the post-2016 congressional legislation has been in an environment where we've only been concerned about deterring China and not concerned about what Taiwan does. But given Taiwan's democratic constraints, I don't think we're going to see a Taiwanese leader doing a Chen Shui-bian, but we are going to see an election coming up where Lai Ching-te is going to be painted as being like that, and we have to be able to negotiate those waters. Third, and also related to the last points, the bipartisanship of the recent congressional legislation may be overstated. There is a real risk that as we get into our own silly season, you're going to see a race to be tougher on China and more pro-Taiwan in a way that may not be in the interest of Taiwan's security. With that, I'll stop, except to say that while Congress has tried, it is very difficult, given the bluntness of legislation, to deal with a couple of the real serious threats out there. One is gray zone stuff. How do you specify exactly how to deal with gray zone? The other is election interference, disinformation, things like that in Taiwan. Those are much harder to handle through legislation, and that requires some degree of deference, I think, to the executive, as well as oversight, however, from Congress. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jacques. A lot on the table. We have 20 minutes left. I'm going to take the prerogative of the chair to ask one question to Annie and then one question to the group, and then I'm going to open it up for Q&A. So with Annie, I want to drill down to one specific thing related to FMF, if you don't mind, and then open a broader question up to the group, that narrative that you all touched on. So for Annie, for you first, the 500 million FMF that was recently passed. We've been waiting a while to see when is it going to pass, how much. Help us understand why, in particular, this FMF program for Taiwan is so important, that's new or different from the past congressional bills.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we were looking at the authorization for FMF and TPA and then TERA, we had a lot of flexibility in that language. We said up to $2 billion per year to allow appropriators, whatever and with consult with Taipei and the executive of what might be an appropriate time. But really, FMF plays a couple of different roles that we thought was really helpful. One is, as I mentioned before, it puts U.S. skin in the game because it's also our money. Obviously, for those of us who have been working on U.S.-Taiwan defense relations for a while, there's always a back and forth about what type of capabilities Taiwan needs to be buying, what their defense strategy should look like, and so on. And it's always, you can't sit on our soapbox and just shake our finger and say, oh, these are the things that you should be buying, or these are the things that you need to do. But if, we're providing our U.S. money and U.S. Some of the stuff that comes with U.S. money, like consultation and regular sustained talks about the procurements themselves, that gives U.S. a little bit more skin in the game and ability to shape, and share information about what we see as the geopolitical tensions. The second thing is it's not the perfect fix for FMS because Lord knows that there are a lot of things that need to be done to help our arms sales process, but it does help. We saw some studies that show that it would help speed up some of our deliveries a little bit. Not to go into too much detail, but basically right now it takes a really long time to negotiate a contract between the U.S. government and the Taiwanese government about stuff, and then the U.S. government has to go to the defense contractor and then negotiate a separate contract with them, and then it becomes this entangled legal mess. We saw FMS as an opportunity to kind of frontline that money so the contractor can get paid and start production earlier while we're still in the negotiation process, because that money is already guaranteed, and that might help speed up delivery timelines. And then, the third, I know there's been a lot of discussion about, it was such a big authorization, a very small appropriation. What does that say about U.S. credibility and so on? My argument, and I'm an authorizer, so take it with a grain of salt, is that we made the language very ambiguous, And I truly don't believe that there would have been an appropriation, even for the $500 million in the FSOPs mark, if it weren't for an authorization previously. We understood that we probably wouldn't be getting $2 billion appropriated in the first year, but we thought it was important because it showed that this is the absorption capacity that we've assessed, and that, you know, we're trying to get kind of the camel's nose under the tent. This is a good first step that we're authorizing it now. And we've had the conversation, as you've seen, there's been more pressure outside to appropriate that money. So even though it isn't the full authorization that was appropriated, we still thought it was important to get the appropriation even at the level that was included in SFOPs, and there wouldn't have been that if we hadn't started the conversation at such a high level, and also started the conversation a year ago to be able to start talking about authorizations for appropriations.
Fantastic, thank you. Okay, to the rest of the group, one topic and narrative that came up with all three of your comments is this concept of deterring versus provoking, the role of the TRA and the role of Congress to help Taiwan have defensive arms to deter an attack, but also doing things that might unintentionally provoke the PRC to accelerate or to be more concerned about the trends of arms that Taiwan has. So, Bonnie, maybe I'll start with you. What specifically do you think, what things that Congress does that worry you, that might be popular, or it might be, something that would be, important for that constituency and for certain members of Congress and for certain constituencies in Taiwan, but that complicates our broader relationship with Taiwan and makes things potentially unhelpful? Are there any examples or things that you in particular are worried about when it comes to what Congress is doing with Taiwan?
I have a list of things that I've gone through the bills that are currently on the table, and so I'll cite a few that I think are problematic. We now have a bill that I believe 19 lawmakers support to recognize Taiwan as an independent country. And in my view, and going back to the issue of what is deterrence, and I published a short article with some colleagues in Foreign Affairs probably about 6 months ago about how deterrence requires credible threats and credible assurance. So in this case, what that means is that if China it sees that the United States is going to recognize Taiwan as an independent sovereign state, if it is going to essentially restore the U.S.-Taiwan Mutual Defense Treaty, which I would say are really China's red lines. There's a lot of things they say is their red lines. That's what I would define them as. And if it sees that that's likely, even if it does not use force against Taiwan, then what prevents it from going ahead and using force anyway? So there has to be some credible assurance in U.S. policy that if China doesn't use force against Taiwan, and I would say coercion being part of the unacceptable part of China's policy that we should push back against, but there is no disincentive for China to refrain from using force. So I really do think you have to look at the credibility of threats and the credibility of assurance. So that's one example. There's the Taiwan Invasion Prevention Act that states that the U.S. President or Secretary of State should visit Taiwan and meet with Taiwan's president. We have two bills introduced, one in the House and one in the Senate just last month, that would rename TECRO, and Jacques has already talked about that. That was raised in the Taiwan Policy Act last year, so that has now come back in the form of another bill. There have been several recommendations by Congress, most recently in the NDAA for FY23, to include Taiwan in RIMPAC. And my understanding is that RIMPAC really isn't a good opportunity for training. So if you want to talk about training Taiwan, there are other ways you could put that in legislation. It doesn't even really require legislation because it's really already in the TRA. But including Taiwan in RIMPAC, I think not only wouldn't significantly enhance the capabilities of the Taiwan Navy, but it might end up in some of our allies actually pulling out of RIMPAC because they don't want to right? Yeah, that's right. We would lose a good part of Southeast Asia. I think ultimately people don't think about the downsides. Just a couple of others. Also from the Taiwan Policy Act was this provision that Taiwan be allowed to display its flag outside of the TECRO office. Ultimately, symbols of sovereignty, I think, should not be allowed unless we're going to change our policy and recognize Taiwan as an independent sovereign state. We don't take a position as a country on Taiwan's sovereignty, and therefore, why would we allow them to display symbols of sovereignty? So I think that's rather inconsistent with our policies. And then we have the version of one of the versions of the TPA that stated the director of the American Institute in Taiwan should be subject to Senate confirmation. That would probably, as we all know, looking at how many appointees have still not been confirmed and how long this process takes in our country, why would we want to introduce something that would slow the appointment of future directors to AIT? So I really don't see how that serves our interests. And Jacques has already mentioned the designation of Taiwan as a major non-NATO ally, but I would again underscore that the U.S. has treated Taiwan as a major non-NATO ally since the George W. Bush administration. My understanding is that provision would have done nothing more than sort of formalize that designation in a way that really it's already in congressional legislation. So these are just some of the examples that I think are not designed to really strengthen Taiwan's security. There are plenty of other examples one could cite that are. So my message is not, Congress is simply harming Taiwan. Absolutely not the case. There's a lot of provisions in legislation and things that have already been passed that I think are useful for Taiwan. And I think foreign military financing is a good example of that. We've also now given Taiwan presidential drawdown authority, which didn't even require any legislation. So there are other things that we are doing that I think are important to bolster Taiwan's security. I just think that Congress isn't really thinking through the potential downsides of some of these bills that they have put forward.
Russell and Jacques, same question to you. Anything you want to add?
Jack, you want to go first, or you want to go?
Sure. So, as is often the case, I agree with Bonnie. A couple of things. Some of the bills also call for diplomatic relations to be restored. That's one step down from recognizing Taiwan as a state. In terms of treating Taiwan as a sovereign state, Taiwan has danced in the fringes of that line, and you don't want Congress to get out ahead of where Taiwan is. If you look at from Lee Teng-hui forward, we've seen this. The Republic of China has been an independent country since 1912 and doesn't see a need to redeclare independence. The Republic of China is an independent sovereign country. Taiwan is an independent sovereign country. You can trace all of that through. What they have avoided is the July 4th moment. Taiwan hereby, as of today, is declaring its separate statehood, and some of these things get it wade perilously close to that water. That would not help Taiwan. I share fully the point that one needs to pay attention to allies who don't want to be forced to choose. That's clearly the entire region is no longer able to say we don't want to choose between the U.S. and China, but to make them choose on this particular issue with relatively empty symbolic things is just a bad policy, it seems to be. The line between symbolism and substance, however, is a fraught one, and I think it's too easy to say don't do symbolic things. Some things get put in the symbolic bucket that I think actually are substantive. So trying to enhance Taiwan's international space, getting it access to the WHA, pushing back against what, as Bonnie and her co-author Jessica Dunn have written, trying to squeeze Taiwan in under 2758, the UN General Assembly resolution. Those are not purely symbolic. Those are substantive, and one doesn't want to put them in the symbol bucket. On the AIT ambassador thing, on the AIT confirmation thing, that is obviously a symbolic thing too. He's the equivalent, or she is the equivalent of an ambassador, right? You need Senate confirmation. So that is not only bad in terms of getting somebody in place, it's another one of these symbolic gestures that I don't think means much. So having beat up on Congress there, I also do want to second the idea that Congress has done a lot of good in these bills. They are useful supplementations in the 4 or 5 ways I tried to say. But the other piece that gets lost in this is legislatures around the world, not just Congress, are in a position to show some love for Taiwan and to push the democracy element because of what they are. They're not official foreign policy, so they don't provoke in that way, and they do underscore the democratic element in a way that the executive branch can't quite fully do.
Oh, okay. All right. I'm of the school that of the mind that symbolism have substantive value, and I think oftentimes my co-panelists, who I think have pointed out some of the challenges of what may be considered symbolic, purely symbolic
I have
measures.
firmly staked out the mushy middle ground.
Okay. And I think that largely overemphasizes the provocation that the PRC would feel in response to any of these types of symbolic measures because of its political signal. And I think, largely the Beijing is very sensitive to those political signals. And as a result of, I think, U.S. excessive deference to the PRC sensitivities is what had led us to up to this point where we have imposed so many self-restraints on our conduct of relations with Taiwan that it has really marginalized Taiwan in a way that the legislative intent of the TRA and the legal foundation did not exclude or preclude the United States from doing. And as such, I think returning to the original intent of the TRA would benefit both in terms of a more, original reading of the intention, as well as also responding to what I think Jacques has pointed out, my co-panelists have pointed out, this really aggressive, international isolation campaign put forward by the PRC in terms of poaching Taiwan's diplomatic partners, as well as preventing it from engaging in a lot of international organizations as well. I would also add that I think it also appreciates the demonstration effects that symbolic actions would have in enhancing Taiwan's international standing. And I think that's critically important in a period of time when I think there's a clear understanding that the United States does not have the means to go at it alone in terms of supporting Taiwan, and it requires a greater international support. And so if the United States were not willing to demonstrate the fact that despite our one China policy, that we can have a more meaningful engagement with Taiwan, how can we expect other countries to similarly do the same? So I would take the opposite argument in terms of what some of concerns with regards to RIMPAC may be a specific case example in terms of how ASEAN countries may be responding to a potential invitation to Taiwan, but really the demonstration effect of allowing other countries to also feel that they can have a means to have a meaningful engagement with Taiwan despite the fact of their own respective one China policies. So I think we need to focus a bit. We can focus a bit more in terms of the positive demonstration effects of how U.S. actions will enable other countries to similarly engage Taiwan on the international stage. And I think that goes to a very important element that is that isn't often discussed in our discussions about these measures, is that it also has the important value of contributing to Taiwan's morale. And I think as we're talking about resiliency and resolve in Taiwan as being critical elements of Taiwan's ability to resist PRC coercion, I think morale is very critically important, and being able for Taiwan's military or its people to be able to engage in the international stage, that is very important for being able to strengthen the morale and the resiliency of the population. And as a result, I think we need to give more considerations about whether these so-called symbolic measures can actually have very important substantive contributions to the situation that Taiwan finds itself in.
Bonnie, you got to follow up.
I just wanted to make one point. I spend a lot of time talking to our allies, both in Asia and in Europe. And I would say when the United States acts in ways that they see are consistent and more predictable, and not in ways that they see as supporting Taiwan as an independent sovereign state, they are more likely to work alongside the U.S. and to support Taiwan. So I think your contention that the more support we show, the more international support Taiwan's going to get is not supported by what we have seen in the last few years. And you can look at Pelosi's visit just as one example, and how many countries criticized the fact that the Speaker of the House went, and may not have done so publicly, but I can tell you privately that they did. Parliamentarians, absolutely different. So certainly much more support from parliamentarians in Europe and more members of parliament that were willing to go. But this was not true in the case of governments. And so I think you have less willingness on the part of governments to support Taiwan when they see the United States as having a less consistent, less predictable policy.
I would raise it just a question.
Sorry.
Mark. Okay, go ahead.
We'll have Annie and then over to
Okay,
Russ.
please.
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to make 2 quick points on this. First, I am going to be the snobby committee staffer and just point out that not every legislation that is introduced is on a markup or on the floor.
Absolutely.
And that's the reason are some of the concerns that we have generally with the legislation itself. But the second issue that I wanted to raise, because I think all our panelists have brought up good points on both sides of the argument. But I think the third concept of this that's missing is the messaging that some of these bills have to the American people and to other Congress folks. So, for example, the AIT director, an intent for pushing on that on the Taiwan Policy Act was because on SFRC, we have jurisdiction over NOMs, and we meet with the NOMs for every single country. So before any ambassador goes out to post, we have a long staff-level conversation with them about our views on policy in that country and how U.S. foreign policy is developing and congressional views on that country and so on. And we don't have that with the AIT director. So it's really, we have a consistent, sustained conversation with every single other ambassador. But with AIT director, it's kind of an ad hoc, if you happen to be on a CODEL in Taiwan, you can meet with her. Or when she happens to be in town, that's when you can meet. But there's no kind of sustained mechanism to have conversations on the AIT with the AIT director. So part of the intent of Congress for that was also because, we just wanted to be able to have our members have the ability to have sustained conversation with the AIT director. But we also completely understand the concerns about having that post not be fulfilled or it gets caught up in broader political nomination politics. So, and then also for some of these other bills, not all of them make it through, but some of the other bills, I think one of the values that they have and even being introduced, even if they don't make it into law, is because it gets members more comfortable with talking about Taiwan and talking about these a little bit more nuanced, maybe sensitive issues where, if we don't have the conversation at all, we're never going to move forward in our policy and we're never going to have a robust relationship with Taiwan. But if we are having these public debates about it, not only are members kind of more comfortable having the other substantive policy debates that we need to have on Taiwan, but it's also a way for the American people to be a little bit more exposed to some of these issues that we face with Taiwan that they might not normally be if their representative from their district isn't championing this bill that is never going to go anywhere. But I think in terms of just the narrative within the United States, we talked a lot about provoking or deterring the PRC or supporting or hurting Taiwan. But within the United States, too, I think there's also a little bit of value in some of these bills, even if they don't get it all the way through.
Thank you, Annie. Russell, I want to give you
Really, that was a great. That
word.
should really be a great way to end this conversation. But I would just offer as a counterpoint to some of the Bonnie's examples is that I don't think we would have seen the Czech Senate and its speaker to go to Taiwan if maybe in the case of the United States speaker had not gone to the Taiwan before, and also as well taking the communication by the new president of the Czech Republic, taking that phone call from President Tsai Ing-wen, had President Trump not taken that phone call when he was the president-elect, would the president of the Czech Republic have similarly gone out in front to do that? And so I think there are important, positive demonstration effects that help to enhance Taiwan's international standing when the United States takes certain actions that are maybe seen as, as purely symbolic.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we are out of time to take audience Q&A, but please join me in thanking the panelists and for this wonderful discussion today, and thank you again for coming.